The autumn wind whispered cold through the pines when they found what remained of Jane Holloway in the abandoned quarry outside Whispering Pines, South Carolina. Population barely 2,700. That October morning, the mist hung heavy between weathered limestone walls, clinging to the rusted metal that had cradled her secret for 2 decades. At 7:32 a.m., a geology student's innocent soil sample revealed what no one had been looking for: fragments of a truth buried since 2002. From that moment, Whispering Pines was never the same, for Jane was simply called Quarry Jane for 20 years. Her real name, her story, and her killer unknown to all but one. What happened in those final hours would shake a town to its core and prove that some secrets refuse to stay buried, no matter how deep we push them down. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the winter of 2002, Whispering Pines, South Carolina, slept beneath an unusual blanket of early frost, with mornings that crackled underfoot and afternoons where breath hung visible in the air. The small town huddled around its single main street, where Christmas lights were already strung between lampposts despite November having barely begun. The town prided itself on knowing everyone, from old Mr. Peterson, who swept his porch every morning at 6 sharp, to the Harris twins who delivered newspapers with remarkable accuracy. It was the kind of place where doors remained unlocked and gossip traveled faster than internet connections. When the call came in to Sheriff Mike Donovan about bones discovered in the old Whispering Heights quarry, most assumed they were ancient, perhaps Native American remains from centuries past. The quarry, abandoned in the 1980s when limestone deposits ran low, had become an unofficial dumping ground despite chain-link fences and no trespassing signs. Sheriff Donovan, his salt and pepper hair matching the November sky, arrived at the scene where college students were conducting geological surveys. A young woman with wide eyes explained how her soil sample had revealed something far different than the mineral composition she'd expected to find. "I kept digging and found what looked like a finger bone," she whispered, hands shaking around her coffee cup. "Then I saw part of a skull." The discovery site sat tucked against the quarry's north face, where shadow covered the ground most of the day. Years of rainwater had carved channels down the stone walls, creating a natural path that had gradually revealed what someone had tried to hide. Sheriff Donovan, who had served Whispering Pines for nearly 30 years, called in the county coroner, an arrangement from a time when small-town deaths were mostly natural, occurring in hospital beds or living room recliners. No one expected what came next. By afternoon, yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the cold breeze. What began as a possible archaeological find quickly transformed into something far more disturbing when the coroner confirmed these were not ancient remains, but a woman, dead no more than 20 years. Female, approximately 20 to 25 years old, he noted, glasses slipping down his nose as he crouched over fragments of bone. Signs of blunt force trauma to the skull. "This is a homicide, Mike." The words hung in the air between them. Homicide. Whispering Pines hadn't seen a murder in 17 years. Not since a domestic dispute turned deadly in 1985. This wasn't just a body. It was an accusation that someone in their close-knit community might be a killer. News traveled with the speed that only small towns manage. By evening, every dinner table buzzed with theories. Children were called in early from play. Doors that had remained unlocked for decades clicked shut that night. Within days, investigators from the state arrived, bringing equipment the local department had never needed. They carefully extracted what remained: a partial skeleton, scraps of denim fabric that had somehow survived the years, a single pearl earring, and a silver watch that had stopped at 11:17, the time forever frozen. But the most crucial element was missing: her identity. No one in Whispering Pines had reported a young woman missing around 2002. No dental records matched the recovered teeth. Local rumors began. Perhaps she was a drifter, a runaway, or someone passing through who had the misfortune of meeting evil on a lonely road. They called her Quarry Jane, the unknown victim whose discovery had shattered the town's peaceful facade. Her photograph, or rather the forensic reconstruction of what she might have looked like, appeared on local news and in the Whispering Pines Gazette. Dark hair framing a heart-shaped face, high cheekbones, and wide-set eyes that seemed to ask from beyond the grave, "Do you know who I am?" Sheriff Donovan established a task force, but with limited evidence and no identity, the investigation stalled. The silver watch revealed a partial serial number that manufacturers confirmed belonged to a limited production, and sold primarily in the Northeast in 2001. The denim fabric came from popular jeans sold in department stores nationwide. The pearl earring was real but common. "She's a ghost," Detective Laurie Winters told her team after weeks of dead ends. "A ghost someone tried to make sure we'd never find." As 2003 arrived with fresh snow and renewed hope, tips dwindled. The Quarry, once a teenage hangout spot, became a morbid landmark that parents warned children away from. Quarry Jane's watching became the new boogeyman threat that kept kids from wandering too far. By summer, the investigation files grew thin. Sheriff Donovan, his face more deeply lined with each passing month, refused to let the case go completely cold. "Someone knows something," he insisted during town meetings. "Someone has noticed a daughter, sister, girlfriend who disappeared around that time." But Whispering Pines returned slowly to normal. The crime scene tape faded in the sun and eventually fell. New gossip replaced old theories. The forensic sketch of Quarry Jane yellowed on post office bulletin boards before someone eventually took them down. Only Sheriff Donovan kept the file on his desk, opening it each Monday morning like a ritual, hoping for the insight that never came. Years passed. Children grew up. Old businesses closed and new ones opened. Sheriff Donovan retired in 2007, passing the badge to his deputy, James Hartman. The case file for Quarry Jane moved to a box, then to a shelf, then to the evidence storage room in the basement of the station. To most of Whispering Pines, she became a local legend, the unknown woman whose bones rested in a marked but unnamed grave in the church cemetery, visited occasionally by curious teenagers or true crime enthusiasts who had read about the case online. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In 2012, on the 10th anniversary of the discovery, the Whispering Pines Gazette ran a retrospective piece. "Decade of Mystery, Quarry, Jane Still Unidentified." The article featured interviews with the now-retired Sheriff Donovan and the geology student who had found the remains, now a professor at a university in Oregon. "I still think about her," the former student admitted. "I wonder who she was, if she had family who never knew what happened to her. Everyone deserves a name." Sheriff Donovan, his once pepper-gray hair now completely white, stared at the camera with tired eyes. "This case has haunted me into retirement. Somewhere out there, someone is missing this young woman. They deserve to know she's been found." The article renewed interest briefly. A few tips came in, none substantial. A psychic offered services that the department politely declined. A true crime podcast featured the case for 2 episodes before moving on to more sensational unsolved mysteries. By 2015, even the anniversary articles stopped. Quarry Jane joined the ranks of the permanently unidentified, one of thousands across the country whose stories remained unfinished. The limestone walls of the quarry continued their slow erosion, revealing new layers each year, but no new secrets. In Whispering Pines, life continued its predictable rhythm. Main Street gained a coffee shop with Wi-Fi. The high school football team made it to state championships. Children who weren't born when Quarry Jane was discovered grew up hearing her story as a cautionary tale about wandering too far from home. Sheriff Hartman, who had inherited the unsolved case, kept the evidence preserved despite budget constraints. "You never know," he told his deputies. "Sometimes science catches up to these old cases." What no one in Whispering Pines realized was that nearly 200 miles away, In Charlotte, North Carolina, a woman named Margaret Brennan checked her mailbox every evening, still hoping for a letter that would never arrive. For 20 years, she had lived with the same daily ritual, coming home from work, opening her mailbox, and feeling the same crushing disappointment. Her daughter, Sarah Brennan, had left for college in 2002 and disappeared during what should have been a weekend trip with friends. Reported missing to Charlotte police, her case became one of many young adults who seemingly vanished by choice. After all, she had taken her car and some belongings. No evidence of foul play existed. She probably just needed space, the detective had suggested after months of fruitless searching. Kids that age sometimes need to reinvent themselves away from family. Margaret never believed it. Sarah, studious and responsible, had been planning to apply to medical school. They spoke by phone every Sunday without fail. The last call had ended with Sarah's cheerful, "Love you, Mom. Talk next week!" But next week never came. For 20 years, Margaret kept her daughter's room untouched. She maintained a dedicated phone line in case Sarah called. She checked missing persons forums and websites daily. She sent Christmas cards to an address that existed only in hope. In January 2022, Margaret's sister convinced her to try something new, a commercial DNA service that had helped other families find missing relatives. "It's been 20 years, Maggie," her sister urged. "What do you have to lose?" The test was simple. A swab inside the cheek, sealed in a plastic tube, mailed to a laboratory where it would join millions of other genetic samples in a vast database. Margaret complied without much hope, adding her DNA to the digital universe of strangers searching for connections. 2 months passed. Winter mellowed toward spring. Cherry blossoms appeared along Charlotte streets. Margaret continued her ritual: work, mailbox, disappointment, sleep. Then on a Tuesday afternoon in March, her phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Normally, she would have let it go to voicemail, assuming another telemarketer. But something made her answer. "Miss Brennan, this is Detective Laurie Winters with the South Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. I'm calling about your daughter, Sarah." Margaret sank into her kitchen chair, the world suddenly muffled around her. 20 years of hope and dread collided in an instant. "We've had an unidentified victim in one of our counties since 2002, the detective continued, her voice gentle but professional. "Your DNA sample flagged as a familial match in our cold case database." The words washed over Margaret in waves. Unidentified, victim, DNA, match, each term carrying devastating weight. "Are you saying you found Sarah?" Margaret whispered, gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles whitened. "We have reason to believe our Jane Doe may be your daughter. We'll need additional confirmation, but the DNA match is extremely strong. After 2 decades of uncertainty, the truth arrived not with a bang, but with clinical precision. Not the reunion Margaret had prayed for, but an end to one question, only to birth 100 more. The local case that had gone cold, the bones in the quarry that had become almost mythological to Whispering Pines. They belonged to someone real, someone missed, someone named Sarah Brennan. The revelation sent shockwaves through 2 communities separated by state lines, but now forever connected. In Whispering Pines, Quarry Jane suddenly had a name, a face from actual photographs rather than forensic estimations, a history beyond fragments of bone. Sheriff Hartman called a press conference on the steps of the small municipal building. News vans from Columbia and Charlotte parked along Main Street. Residents gathered, some who remembered the discovery vividly, others who knew it only as town lore. Today, after 20 years, I can announce that the remains discovered in Whispering Heights Quarry in 2002 have been positively identified as Sarah Brennan, a 22-year-old student from Charlotte, North Carolina, he announced, cameras flashing. This identification was made possible through advances in DNA technology and the courage of a mother who never stopped looking for her daughter. Margaret Brennan stood slightly behind him, smaller than she appeared in family photos with Sarah, aged beyond her years by 2 decades of uncertainty. When invited to speak, she stepped forward, hands trembling around a photograph of her daughter, Sarah in a blue graduation gown, smile radiant with promise. "My daughter was bright, loving, and had her whole life ahead of her," Margaret said, voice steady despite her tears. "Someone took that away and left her where they thought she would never be found. I'm grateful she has her name back. Now I ask for justice." The identification transformed the investigation. What had been a cold case with scant evidence became an active murder investigation. Sarah's life was reconstructed, her friends contacted, her movements in those final days traced. The silver watch confirmed as a birthday gift from her mother. The pearl earring part of a set she wore daily. Most crucially, investigators learned Sarah had told roommates she was meeting someone in South Carolina that weekend. Someone she was excited about but mysteriously refused to name. "It's complicated," she had told her best friend. "I'll tell you everything when I get back." She never returned to tell that story. Her car, a blue Honda Civic, had never been found. Her bank account showed a withdrawal of $200 the day before she disappeared, but no activity thereafter. Her phone records showed a final call to an unregistered prepaid phone that investigators could not trace. In Whispering Pines, residents struggled with a new reality. Not only had their town harbored an unidentified victim for years, but now they faced the possibility that someone local might be connected to her death. After all, who else would know about the abandoned quarry, its hidden corners, its infrequent visitors? Sheriff Hartman formed a new task force, reopening interviews with anyone who lived in the area in 2002. Old yearbooks were examined, looking for connections between local young men and a college student from Charlotte. Sarah's photograph appeared where once the forensic sketch had hung, this time with the heading, "Justice for Sarah," rather than "Do you know me?" The church cemetery held a new ceremony, replacing the stone marked only Jane Doe, with one bearing Sarah's name, birth date, and the simple inscription chosen by her mother. "Found at last, forever loved." Margaret Brennan moved into a small rental house in Whispering Pines, determined to be present for the investigation. Each morning, she walked to the sheriff's office to ask for updates. Each evening, she visited her daughter's grave. Her quiet presence became a constant reminder of the human cost behind the sensational headlines. "I waited 20 years to find her," she told Sheriff Hartman. "I can wait a little longer for justice." As 2022 stretched into summer, the investigation gained unexpected momentum when a former Whispering Pines resident, now living in Arizona, called the tip line. He had been cleaning out his late father's garage and found a box of old photographs, including several of the quarry from 2002, taken during a high school project about local geology. "There's something in the background of one picture," he said. "A blue car partially covered with branches. I never noticed it before." The photograph, grainy but clear enough, showed what appeared to be a Honda Civic half hidden among trees near the quarry entrance. The date stamp read June 17, 2002, 3 days after Sarah was last seen alive. For the first time in 20 years, Whispering Pines and its quiet residents faced an uncomfortable truth that had been literally buried in their midst. Someone had known exactly where to hide a body and a car. Someone had walked among them for 2 decades carrying this secret. Someone had looked into the eyes of a forensic sketch, perhaps even attended memorial services, all while knowing exactly who Quarry Jane really was. The question that had haunted the town for 20 years, "Who is she?" had finally been answered. But a new, more terrifying question took its place. Who among us did this? And after 20 years of freedom, would justice finally catch up to them? The discovery of Sarah Brennan's identity transformed Whispering Pines overnight. Television vans lined Main Street. Reporters with microphones asked residents about a murder most had only known as distant legend. The photograph showing a blue Honda Civic near the quarry became the new center of the investigation, concrete evidence after decades of speculation. Sheriff Hartman converted the town hall meeting room into an expanded incident command center. Maps of 2002, Whispering pines covered the walls, red pins marking where Sarah's remains, and now, potentially, her car had been found. Yellow pins showed who lived nearby. Green pins indicated who had been interviewed. What we need to understand, Hartman told his assembled team, is who Sarah Brennan was meeting here. No one drives 200 miles on a weekend without a compelling reason. Detective Laurie Winters, who had worked the case since its discovery and now approaching retirement herself, pinned Sarah's college photograph to the center of the board. 20 years is a long time, she said, but secrets have a way of growing brittle with age. Margaret Brennan became a quiet fixture in Whispering Pines, her grey hair and stooped shoulders unmistakable as she walked from her rental cottage to the sheriff's office each morning. Locals nodded respectfully, some offering condolences, others averting their eyes, uncertain how to face the human embodiment of their town's darkest chapter. At the Sunrise Cafe, Margaret sat alone each morning, notebook open, writing down memories of Sarah as if cataloguing treasures. The ritual seemed to sustain her through unbearable days. On her third morning there, Ellie Mason, the cafe owner, approached with a fresh coffee pot. "Mind if I join you for a minute?" she asked, sliding into the booth without waiting for permission. "I was here in 2002. My parents owned this place then." Margaret looked up, eyes sharp with sudden interest. "Did you know Sarah?" Ellie shook her head. "No, but I might have seen her. There was a girl who came in that weekend, not from around here, polite, kept checking her watch. Said she was meeting someone who was running late." She paused, pouring coffee into Margaret's cup. "I never connected it until I saw her photo on the news yesterday. The first thread appeared so fragile it might snap if pulled too hard. Sarah had been here, sitting perhaps at this very booth, waiting for someone who might have been the last person to see her alive." "What time was this?" Margaret asked, pen poised over her notebook. "Early evening, around 6. Dad was cooking steaks, Friday special." Ellie's eyes focused on something distant. She ordered tea, kept looking out the window toward the parking lot. Did you see who she eventually met?" Ellie shook her head. "My shift ended at 7. When I left, she was still waiting." Margaret wrote everything down, her handwriting precise despite her trembling hand. Later that day, she brought this information to Sheriff Hartman, who added it to the growing timeline. Sarah Brennan, alive in Whispering Pines at approximately 6 p.m. on Friday, June 14th, 2002. The investigation gained momentum from this simple human connection. Sheriff Hartman organized a search of the quarry area using modern ground-penetrating radar to locate the car from the photograph. The technology, unavailable in 2002, revealed a metal mass consistent with a vehicle, buried under layers of rock and dirt near the quarry's west entrance. "Someone took time to conceal it," the technician explained, showing Hartman the shadowy images. "This wasn't just abandoned. It was deliberately buried." The excavation began on a Tuesday morning in early April. News cameras captured every moment as heavy machinery carefully removed layers of earth. Margaret Brennan watched from a distance, a black umbrella shielding her from a light rain that seemed fitting for the somber occasion. By midday, the first glint of faded blue metal emerged from the dirt. Workers switched to hand tools, archaeologists joining to ensure nothing was damaged or overlooked. Inch by inch, the Honda Civic was revealed, its windows shattered, its body crushed by rocks, but unmistakably the vehicle Sarah had driven from Charlotte 20 years before. The license plate confirmation sent a visible shudder through the gathered crowd. This was no longer town legend or campfire story. This was real evidence of a life stolen, deliberately hidden, where the killer thought it would remain forever. Forensic teams descended on the site, photographing everything before the car was carefully extracted and transported to a secure facility. Inside, they found Sarah's purse tucked beneath the passenger seat, her student ID still visible through the clear plastic window of her wallet. A mix CD labeled Road Trip Music remained in the stereo. A half-empty water bottle, a campus parking permit. The everyday items of a young woman who had expected to return home hit everyone harder than the skeletal remains had. These weren't just evidence, they were artifacts of interrupted life, Most significant was a small notebook found in the glove compartment. Inside, in Sarah's handwriting, was a single entry dated June 14th, 2002. Meeting T at sunrise, Sixk, then surprise. BT, the first initial of someone who might have lured Sarah to her death. Someone who might still be living in Whispering Pines. Or someone who, like Sarah, had vanished from the story years ago. Sheriff Hartman called a press conference, revealing the car's discovery but strategically withholding the notebook detail. "We're making significant progress," he told the assembled reporters. "But we need the community's help. Anyone who remembers seeing Sarah Brennan or her blue Honda Civic that weekend should come forward immediately." The announcement prompted an unexpected visitor to the sheriff's office the following morning. Thomas Wilson, now 67, had been the manager of the Whispering Pines Gas and Go in 2002. Retired for over a decade, he arrived leaning on a cane, his breathing labored from years of cigarettes. "I've been watching the news," he told Detective Winters. "That girl, the one you found, I remember her car." The interview room camera recorded his statement as Wilson described a blue Honda Civic pulling into the station late Friday night. "Pretty girl, looked out of place. Paid cash for gas, asked directions to Larkspur Road." "What time was this?" Winters asked, keeping her voice neutral despite her racing heart. "After 10. I was closing up. Remember thinking it was odd she'd be looking for Larkspur that late. Nothing out there but the old Burnham property." The Burnham property, once a sprawling farmhouse and barn owned by one of the founding families, abandoned in the 1990s after the last Burnham passed away. The land had been vacant in 2002, later purchased by developers who converted it into vacation cabins around 2010. Was she alone? Winters pressed. Wilson shook his head slowly. There was a man waiting in the car. Young fellow didn't get a good look at his face. She seemed to know him, though, wasn't scared or nothing. Another piece clicking into place. Sarah had met someone, likely the mysterious T, and they had driven together toward an isolated property after dark. The timeline was forming with agonizing clarity. Sheriff Hartman dispatched officers to locate anyone named with a first. Initial T, who had lived in Whispering Pines in 2002. The list came back with 17 names, from teenagers to senior citizens. From Timothy Allen, who had worked at the hardware store, to Teresa Jenkins, who had taught third grade for 30 years. Each would need to be located, interviewed, and potentially eliminated. Some had moved away, some had died. Each represented a path that might lead to justice or another dead end. Meanwhile, forensic analysis of the Honda revealed more secrets. The driver's side door showed signs of being forced open, the lock mechanism damaged from the outside. Blood stains, nearly invisible after 2 decades, but revealed under specialized lighting, marked the steering wheel and driver's seat. Sarah had been injured inside her own car before being taken to the quarry. Most tellingly, a partial fingerprint was lifted from the rearview mirror, preserved by a coating of dust that had settled over it before the elements could destroy it completely. The print was run through updated databases, searching for matches among those with criminal records and government employees. In Whispering Pines, the mood shifted from shock to unease. Residents eyed longtime neighbors with new suspicion. Who among them knew more than they had shared? Who might have been the last to see Sarah Brennan alive? Whose name began with T? The discovery that threatened to tear the community apart came not from high-tech forensics, but from an elderly woman with a meticulously kept diary. Helen Crawford, 84, had lived in the same house on Maple Street since 1965. When news of Sarah's identification broke, her granddaughter visited from Colombia, helping her organize old belongings. "Gran, did you ever hear about that girl they found in the quarry?" she asked casually, sorting through a box of old photographs. Helen adjusted her glasses. "Course I did. Terrible business. I remember seeing a blue car like hers that weekend, driving past my house after dark." The granddaughter froze. "You saw her car. Did you tell the police?" "Of course I did, dear." "Told that young deputy, Trent Reynolds, I think his name was." Handsome boy, always so polite when he'd stop by to check on me during his patrols. Helen frowned. He took notes and everything, said he'd pass it along to the sheriff. Must not have been important. Trent Reynolds. The name hit the investigation like a thunderbolt when Helen's granddaughter called the tip line. Reynolds had been a deputy in 2002, 26 years old, relatively new to the force. He had left Whispering Pines in 2004, citing family reasons, moving west to Arizona. More crucially, there was no record of Helen Crawford's statement in any of the case files. No mention of a blue Honda sighting. No follow-up noted. Sheriff Hartman personally visited Helen, bringing the original case files. "Ma'am, are you certain you spoke with Deputy Reynolds about this?" Helen nodded firmly. June 15th, 2002. Wrote it right here. She opened a leather-bound diary to a yellowed page. In perfect penmanship was the entry. Deputy Reynolds took statement about blue car passing house last night, around 11:30. Driver not visible. Going very fast toward Quarry Road. The diary entry existed. The official report did not. Trent Reynolds, whose first initial was T, had deliberately omitted evidence from an investigation. The same Trent Reynolds, who had been among the first responders when Sarah's remains were discovered months later. Background checks revealed more disturbing connections. Reynolds had attended the same community college as Sarah 2 years before she enrolled at university in Charlotte. Yearbook photos showed them in one overlapping club, the Environmental Awareness Society. They had likely known each other. Reynolds' personnel file contained a reprimand from April 2002, 2 months before Sarah's disappearance, for unauthorized use of department resources. He had run a license plate check on a vehicle registered to Sarah Brennan with no case number attached to the query. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. A known connection to the victim, a deleted witness statement, a suspicious database search, a hasty departure from town, and the damning first initial that matched Sarah's final diary entry. Locating Reynolds proved challenging. After leaving Whispering Pines, he had moved frequently, Arizona, Nevada, Oregon, never staying more than a few years in one place. Never again working in law enforcement. The pattern of a man running from something. Detective Winters finally traced him to a remote cabin outside Flagstaff, Arizona. Local authorities conducted surveillance, confirming his identity, while South Carolina prepared extradition paperwork. The arrest had to be handled perfectly. 20 years had passed, and any legal misstep could jeopardize the entire case. Margaret Brennan received the news in Sheriff Hartman's office, the spring sunshine creating patterns on the worn carpet. "We believe we've identified a person of interest," he told her carefully. "Someone who knew Sarah and was in a position to interfere with the investigation." "Who?" Margaret asked, her voice barely audible. "A former deputy named Trent Reynolds. He may have been the last person to see Sarah alive." Margaret's hands clutched her purse so tightly, her knuckles whitened. "When will you arrest him?" "We're coordinating with Arizona authorities now. We don't want to move too quickly and risk losing him." But Reynolds had been watching the news too. That evening, a neighbor reported seeing him loading his truck and driving away from his cabin. By the time Arizona police arrived, he was gone. Clothes left behind, food still on the table, door left open in his haste. The manhunt began, expanding across state lines. Reynolds' photograph appeared on national news broadcasts. Highway patrols received alerts. Border checkpoints were notified. A man who had hidden a secret for 20 years was now the most sought-after fugitive in the country. In Whispering Pines, the revelation that a former deputy might be responsible sent shockwaves through the community. Older residents who remembered Reynolds described him as quiet, polite, dedicated. "Never would have suspected," became the common refrain. Former Sheriff Donovan, now in his 80s and living in a retirement community, was devastated by the news. "I trusted that boy," he told investigators. "Put him in uniform myself." Meanwhile, forensic technicians made another breakthrough. The partial fingerprint from the rearview mirror was confirmed as belonging to Reynolds. His prints were on file from his police employment. The final piece that transformed circumstantial evidence into a solid case. 3 days into the manhunt, with Reynolds still at large, Margaret Brennan made an unexpected request. She asked to address the public directly in a televised statement. Sheriff Hartman agreed, arranging a press conference on the courthouse steps. Margaret stood before the microphones, a small figure against the imposing white columns. Her voice, which had been so fragile in private, found new strength as cameras rolled. "My name is Margaret Brennan. 20 years ago, my daughter Sarah drove to Whispering Pines and never returned home. For 2 decades, I checked my mailbox every day, hoping for a letter that would never come. I kept her room exactly as she left it. I celebrated her birthday every year with a small cake no one would eat." She paused, her eyes moving across the gathered crowd. "To Trent Reynolds, I say this: running won't bring you peace. It hasn't for 20 years. Whatever happened that night, whatever went wrong between you and Sarah, facing it is the only way this ends. For both our sakes." Her words, broadcast nationwide, reached into the corners where a fugitive might hide. Whether they moved Reynolds or simply increased the pressure, no one could say. But the following morning, a man walked into a police station in Santa Fe, New Mexico. "My name is Trent Reynolds," he told the desk sergeant. "I believe you're looking for me." The extradition to South Carolina took place under heavy security. News helicopters tracked the convoy from the airport to the county detention center. Crowds gathered along the route, some holding photographs of Sarah, others simply watching in solemn silence. Reynolds, now 46, his dark hair grayed at the temples, kept his head down as officers led him into the building. His face, once youthful in old department photographs, had hardened into something unreadable. The interrogation room where he finally sat across from Detective Winters was simple: a table, 3 chairs, a recording device. No windows, no distractions. Just 2 people and 20 years of secrets between them. "We know you knew Sarah Brennan," Winters began. "We know you ran her plates before she disappeared. We know you took a witness statement about her car and deliberately omitted it from your report." Reynolds stared at the table, saying nothing. "We have your fingerprint in her car. We have evidence you were the T she was meeting that night." Winters laid out photographs of the Honda Civic, the notebook, the quarry. "What happened, Trent? What went wrong?" For nearly an hour, he remained silent, refusing even water when offered. Then, as if a dam had broken, he began to speak in a voice rough from disuse. "I never meant to hurt her," he said, the words hanging in the air between them. "You have to believe that." The confession unfolded slowly, a story 20 years in the making. Reynolds had met Sarah during his community college days. They had dated briefly before going separate ways. Years later, she contacted him after seeing his name in a local newspaper article about new deputies in Whispering Pines. She was dating someone in Charlotte but wanted to reconnect as friends, he explained. We exchanged emails. She was planning to apply to medical schools. Asked if she could visit, see the town. The meeting at Sunrise Cafe had been innocent enough. Catching up, reminiscing about college days. But Reynolds admitted he had hoped for more, had misinterpreted her friendliness, her willingness to drive so far to see him. After dinner, I showed her around town in my truck, took her to the lookout point near the quarry. I told her how I still had feelings for her. His voice faltered. She was kind about it, but clear she wasn't interested that way. Said she was serious about her boyfriend back in Charlotte. The rejection had sparked something dark. Reynolds described an argument that escalated, his pride wounded, his anger growing. I was driving her back to her car at the gas station. She wanted to leave immediately, said coming had been a mistake. I couldn't let her go like that. He described pulling onto the deserted Burnham property, the argument intensifying. Sarah attempting to exit the truck. Reynolds grabbing her arm, not intending harm, but preventing escape. In the struggle, she fell, hitting her head against the truck's doorframe. There was so much blood, he whispered. I panicked. She was unconscious. I checked her pulse and couldn't find one. I convinced myself she was dead, that I'd killed her. What followed was a calculated cover-up. Reynolds returned to the gas station, driving Sarah's car with her body inside. He took it to the quarry's western edge, to a depression he knew would be difficult to spot. He concealed the vehicle, buried it under rocks and dirt over several nights, using his position as a deputy to move freely without suspicion. When her remains were found months later, I thought they would connect it to her car right away, he admitted. But they didn't have the technology then. There was no missing person report matching her in our county. I destroyed Helen Crawford's statement about the car. I thought it was over. The most chilling revelation came last. The autopsy had shown Sarah died from blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with Reynolds's account of an accidental fall. But it also revealed something he hadn't known. Sarah hadn't died immediately. Forensic evidence indicated she had been alive, though unconscious, when the car was buried. She had died slowly, trapped in darkness, while the man who put her there returned to patrol the streets of Whispering Pines. Reynolds covered his face with his hands. I've lived with this every day for 20 years, seeing her face in my dreams, wondering who would find her and when. Detective Winters stared at him across the table, her face professionally blank, despite the horror of his confession. You were a police officer, Trent. You could have called for help. She might have survived. I know, he whispered. That's why I ran. And that's why I came back. Nothing I can say will ever make this right. As Reynolds was led to a cell, the reality of what had happened that night in 2002 finally emerged from shadow. Not a calculated murder, but a tragic series of events made unforgivable by cowardice and cover-up. A young woman with her future ahead of her. A young man who chose self-preservation over truth. And 20 years of consequences rippling outward, touching countless lives. Outside the detention center, Margaret Brennan stood in the fading light, reporters keeping a respectful distance. When asked how she felt, knowing the truth at last, she looked toward the horizon, where the sun was setting over distant hills. The wound was always there, she said quietly. Now at least I know its shape. The courthouse in Whispering Pines had stood since 1893, weathering storms both meteorological and societal. Its wooden benches, worn smooth by generations, now held spectators for the most significant trial in the town's history. Outside, summer heat shimmered off the pavement as reporters maintained their vigil, cameras trained on the ornate double doors. Inside, the air conditioning hummed ineffectively against the June warmth and the press of bodies. Judge Eleanor Blackwood, her silver hair pulled into a severe bun, peered over reading glasses at the packed gallery. At the defense table sat Trent Reynolds in a navy suit that hung loose on his frame, flanked by his attorney. Opposite them, the prosecution team arranged files with methodical precision. In the front row behind the prosecution sat Margaret Brennan, dressed in a simple black dress, her hands folded in her lap. She had attended every hearing, every motion, her silent presence a reminder of why they were all there. "All rise," called the bailiff, as proceedings began on the first day of testimony. The prosecution's opening statement painted a timeline of betrayal. A young woman lured to a small town by someone she trusted, killed in a moment of rage, her body and vehicle hidden by the very person sworn to uphold the law. Sarah Brennan did not simply disappear, stated Prosecutor Mitchell Hayes, his voice carrying to the back of the courtroom. She was erased by the defendant's actions that night and by his deliberate obstruction of the investigation for 20 years. The defense countered with a narrative of tragic accident and panic-induced poor decisions. "Mr. Reynolds has admitted to his role in this tragedy," his attorney emphasized. But what happened that night was not murder. It was a terrible accident followed by a young man's terrible mistake. As witnesses began to take the stand, Whispering Pines relived its darkest chapter. Helen Crawford, now requiring assistance to walk, testified about seeing the blue Honda and reporting it to Reynolds. Thomas Wilson recounted Sarah asking directions to Larkspur Road. Ellie Mason described serving Sarah tea while she waited at sunrise. Cafe. Each testimony added another tile to the mosaic of Sarah's final hours, bringing her from abstraction, bones in a quarry, a forensic sketch, into vivid reality. A young woman in a strange town, meeting a former classmate, unaware of the trajectory her evening would take. Forensic experts presented evidence with clinical precision. The blood patterns in the vehicle, consistent with blunt force trauma. The positioning of remains, suggesting Sarah had been unconscious but alive when the car was concealed. The methodical burial of the vehicle demonstrating not panic but calculation. Throughout the testimony, Reynolds sat motionless, eyes fixed on the table before him. Only when photographs of Sarah appeared on the evidence screen did he visibly react. A subtle flinching, as if from physical pain. On the third day, Margaret Brennan took the stand as a victim impact witness. The courtroom fell silent as she settled into the witness chair, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. "Mrs. Brennan," the prosecutor began gently, "could you tell the court about your daughter?" Margaret nodded, her voice surprisingly steady. Sarah was thoughtful. Even as a child, she noticed things others missed. A neighbor needing help with groceries, a classmate without lunch money. She decided on medical school after her father died from heart disease. She wanted to help people like him. As Margaret spoke, she removed a small photograph from her purse. Sarah at her college sophomore formal, dark hair elegantly styled, smile radiant. This was the last professional photograph taken of her. She was 22 with everything ahead of her. The prosecutor guided her through the years after Sarah's disappearance. The unanswered calls, the mailbox checked daily, the room preserved like a shrine. "I knew in my heart she would never have left without saying goodbye," Margaret said. But without answers there was only this terrible space where closure should be. When asked how learning the truth had affected her, Margaret looked directly at Reynolds for the first time. Finding Sarah brought peace and pain in equal measure. "I no longer wonder where she is, but knowing how frightened she must have been, alone in that darkness." Her voice faltered momentarily. No mother should have to imagine such things. The cross-examination was brief and respectful. The defense attorney wise enough to recognize that challenging Margaret Brennan would only damage their case further in the eyes of the jury. As she left the witness stand, Margaret paused beside the defense table. Reynolds raised his head, meeting her gaze. No words were exchanged, but something passed between them. An acknowledgement, perhaps, or the setting of a boundary. Then Margaret returned to her seat, back straight, eyes forward. On the fourth day, the moment the courtroom had been waiting for arrived. Trent Reynolds took the stand in his own defense. He walked to the witness box without handcuffs, having been free on bail due to his voluntary surrender and lack of flight risk following his return from New Mexico. The man who had once worn the Whispering Pines deputy uniform with pride now seemed diminished, his shoulders hunched as if carrying a physical weight. Under his attorney's questioning, Reynolds described his history with Sarah, their brief relationship in community college, the friendly emails years later, his hope that her visit might rekindle something between them. "When did you realize Sarah didn't share your feelings?" his attorney asked. Reynolds swallowed hard. "At the lookout point. I tried to kiss her. She pulled away, told me she was committed to her boyfriend in Charlotte. Said she thought I understood we were just friends." "And how did that make you feel?" "Embarrassed, angry. I'd misread everything, built it up in my head." Reynolds stared at his hands. "I started arguing with her, saying she'd led me on by coming all this way. It wasn't true, but I was hurt." His testimony continued, detailing the escalating argument in his truck, Sarah's demand to be taken back to her car, his refusal, her attempt to exit the moving vehicle. "I grabbed her arm to stop her from jumping out. The truck jerked. She fell against the doorframe." Reynolds described the panic upon seeing blood, checking for a pulse with shaking hands, convincing himself she was already dead. "I was a cop. I should have called for help, started CPR, done something. Instead, I thought only of myself, how it would look, what would happen to my career." The decision to hide the car came next. Driving Sarah's Honda with her inside to the quarry, using his knowledge of the area to find a spot unlikely to be discovered. "I told myself if no one found her, it never happened," he said, voice hollow. "I could go on with my life." When the prosecutor's turn came, the questioning turned sharper. "Officer Reynolds, you were an officer then, correct? You had training in emergency medicine as part of your police certification." "Yes." You knew that pulse checks can be difficult in high-stress situations, that even medical professionals sometimes miss pulses that are present? Reynolds nodded slowly. Yes, yet you made no attempt to verify your assessment. No CPR, no call for paramedics? No. And in the days following, as Sarah's family surely began searching for her, you deliberately destroyed evidence that might have led to her discovery. Yes. The prosecutor approached the witness stand. Mr. Reynolds, the medical examiner testified that Sarah Brennan likely survived for hours after her injury. That had medical attention been sought, she might have recovered completely. Do you understand that? Reynolds closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, tears tracked down his face. I understand that I killed her twice, once by accident and once by choice. It was the most damning testimony he could have given, and perhaps the most honest. After 5 days of evidence and arguments, the case went to the jury. Whispering Pines held its collective breath as deliberations began. In coffee shops and living rooms, debates raged about appropriate punishment. Was it murder or manslaughter? Was 20 years of carrying such a secret punishment enough, or merely the prelude to justice? The jury reached their verdict after 14 hours of deliberation. Guilty of manslaughter rather than murder, but guilty of all charges related to evidence tampering and obstruction of justice. The combined charges carried a potential sentence of 15 to 25 years. 2 weeks later, the town gathered once more for the sentencing hearing. Judge Blackwood listened as both sides made their final arguments. The prosecution pushed for the maximum, citing the calculated nature of the cover-up and the position of trust Reynolds had violated. The defense emphasized his eventual voluntary surrender and full confession. Before announcing her decision, Judge Blackwood offered Reynolds the traditional opportunity to speak. He rose slowly, turning first toward Margaret Brennan rather than the bench. I've prepared statements and torn them up a dozen times, he began. Nothing I can say will undo what I've done. Nothing will bring Sarah back or give you back the 20 years I stole from both of you. Reynolds faced the judge. I don't ask for leniency. What I did was unforgivable. Not just taking a life, but hiding the truth from a mother who deserved to know what happened to her daughter. I've lived with this every day, but my suffering doesn't balance the scales. I'm ready to face whatever punishment the court decides is appropriate. Judge Blackwood studied him for a long moment before delivering her sentence. 20 years for manslaughter and obstruction of justice, with 5 years suspended. Mr. Reynolds, you will serve a year for each year you allowed Sarah Brennan's family to live in uncertainty. Perhaps in that time you will find a way to make amends for what cannot be undone. As Reynolds was led away, a chapter closed in Whispering Pines. The sensational case that had drawn national attention began to recede from headlines. Television trucks packed up their equipment. Reporters checked out of the small bed and breakfast that had been their temporary home. The town was left to process what had happened and what it meant for their community. For Margaret Brennan, the trial's end brought a different kind of threshold. After the sentencing, she visited Sarah's grave one last time before preparing to return to Charlotte. The small cemetery was peaceful in the late afternoon light, birds calling from nearby trees. She was arranging fresh flowers when she noticed she wasn't alone. Detective Laurie Winters stood a respectful distance away, waiting to be acknowledged. I wanted to say goodbye, Winters said, approaching when Margaret nodded to her, and to give you something. She held out a small evidence bag containing a pearl earring, the match to the one found with Sarah's remains. We recovered this from her car. The case is closed now, so it belongs with her family. Margaret accepted it, closing her fingers around the small pearl. Thank you for this and for not giving up on finding the truth. Winters looked down at the gravestone, now properly marked with Sarah's name and dates. In my 30 years of police work, this case affected me the most. Not just because it took so long, but because of what it revealed about trust and responsibility. Do you think he's truly sorry? Margaret asked suddenly, or just sorry he was caught? Winters considered the question carefully. I believe regret and self-preservation can exist in the same heart. He lived with this knowledge for 20 years. That's its own kind of prison. Not the same as the one Sarah was buried in, Margaret replied, her voice carrying no anger, only a profound sadness. No, Winters agreed quietly. Not the same at all. They stood in silence for several minutes before Margaret spoke again. I'm selling my house in Charlotte. There's a small cottage for rent here near the town square. I think I'll stay in Whispering Pines for a while. Winters looked surprised. After everything that happened here? Margaret touched the headstone gently. This is where Sarah is. And there's something about this place now, the way the community came together to find answers, the people who kept searching when others had given up. It feels right to be here. The decision to remain in Whispering Pines rippled through the community. Margaret Brennan, who had arrived as a grieving mother seeking answers, was choosing to become part of the town that had both hidden and ultimately revealed the truth about her daughter. In the months that followed, Margaret established herself as a quiet but steadfast presence. She volunteered at the library 2 afternoons a week. She joined the congregation at St. Matthew's Church. She could be found most mornings at the Sunrise Cafe, in the same booth where Sarah had waited 20 years earlier. Gradually, tentatively, residents began to approach her, not with morbid curiosity, but with genuine connection. Ellie Mason from the cafe became a regular lunch companion. Helen Crawford, when her health permitted, invited Margaret for tea. Even former Sheriff Donovan, still grappling with his deputy's betrayal, found the courage to visit, bringing freshly picked apples from his small orchard as a peace offering. Margaret's presence became a form of healing for Whispering Pines, not through dramatic gestures or public statements, but through the simple act of continuing to live in a place marked by tragedy. Her forgiveness, never stated outright but evident in her choice to remain, offered a path forward for a community still processing its role in Sarah's story. 1 year after the trial, Margaret approached Mayor Collins with an unexpected proposal. The quarry where Sarah was found has become a place people avoid, she explained. I'd like to change that, turn it into something that honors not just Sarah, but all missing persons whose families still wait for answers. The idea took root quickly. The town council approved rezoning the quarry area as a memorial park. Local businesses donated materials and labor. What had been a site of hidden tragedy began its transformation into a place of reflection and hope. On a crisp October morning, 2 years after Sarah's identification, the Sarah Brennan Memorial Garden opened to the public. The once abandoned quarry, its harsh contours softened by landscaping, featured winding paths, stone benches, and native wildflowers. At its center stood a simple fountain, water flowing over smooth river rocks, bearing a plaque with words Margaret had chosen, for Sarah, and for all those still waiting to be found. May the search for truth never end. The dedication ceremony drew hundreds, not just from Whispering Pines, but from surrounding communities and beyond. Families of missing persons traveled from neighboring states, finding connection in shared experience. Among them stood Detective Winters, now retired, but still committed to the work of finding answers. Margaret addressed the gathered crowd, her voice carrying across what had once been a place of secrets. 20 years ago, my daughter Sarah came to Whispering Pines and never left. For 2 decades, I lived in the shadow of not knowing, a particular kind of grief that has no resolution. She gestured toward the transformed landscape around them. This place was once where truth was buried. Now it stands as a promise that no matter how long it takes, the truth deserves to be found. Not just for closure, but because every person who has vanished was someone's child, someone's friend, someone's love. In the years that followed, the memorial garden became known beyond Whispering Pines. Families searching for missing loved ones found it a place of solace. Law enforcement agencies held annual cold case review sessions there, renewing commitments to unsolved disappearances. Volunteers trained search and rescue dogs among its paths. What began in tragedy evolved into something unexpected, a community dedicated to ensuring no other family would wait 20 years for answers. The Sheriff's Department established a specialized cold case unit. The local newspaper ran monthly features highlighting unsolved disappearances throughout the region. Ordinary citizens trained as volunteers for search operations. Margaret Brennan, who had come to Whispering Pines as a stranger seeking her daughter, became the quiet center of these efforts. Not through grand gestures or public speeches, but through persistent presence and the moral authority that came from having walked the longest, darkest road a parent could travel. 5 years after Sarah's identification, Margaret received a letter from the state penitentiary where Trent Reynolds was serving his sentence. She let it sit unopened on her kitchen table for 3 days before finally breaking the seal. "Mrs. Brennan," it began in careful handwriting, "I've started this letter 100 times. There's nothing I can say to repair what I've broken. But I need you to know that not a day passes when I don't think of Sarah and what I took from her and from you." The letter continued, describing Reynolds' work with prison ministry programs and his efforts to counsel younger inmates away from the path of lies and cover-ups he had chosen. "I know I have no right to ask forgiveness," he wrote, "but I want you to know that Sarah's life and your strength have changed how I live whatever time I have left, whether in this prison or the larger one I built for myself 20 years ago." Margaret never replied directly to the letter, but in her next visit to the memorial garden, she left a small, smooth stone at the fountain, a traditional symbol of remembrance in many cultures. Whether it was acknowledgement, forgiveness, or simply her own form of closure, she kept to herself. The story of Sarah Brennan and Whispering Pines eventually faded from national headlines, replaced by newer tragedies and mysteries. But its impact continued in less visible ways, in improved protocols for missing persons cases, in families who found strength in Margaret's example, in law enforcement officers who remembered that no case is truly cold as long as someone still searches for answers. For the residents of Whispering Pines, the legacy was more personal. They had witnessed both the worst and best of their community, the capacity for deception and the equal capacity for redemption. The town that once harbored a terrible secret became known instead for its commitment to truth, however belated or painful. On the 10th anniversary of Sarah's identification, Margaret Brennan stood once more in the memorial garden, now lush with mature trees and flowering shrubs. She was no longer the grieving mother who had arrived in town with a photograph and desperate hope. Her hair had whitened completely, her face softened with age, but her eyes remained clear and direct. A small gathering had assembled for the occasion, Detective Winters using a cane now, but still sharp-minded, Helen Crawford in her wheelchair, reaching her 90s, Mayor Collins and his successor, families who had found their own missing loved ones through the networks that grew from Sarah's case, and families still waiting, drawing strength from each other. 10 years ago, we learned that no truth stays buried forever, Margaret told them, her voice carrying on the autumn breeze. What we've built since then isn't just a memorial to those we've lost, but a promise to those still searching. She gestured toward the fountain, where water continued its endless cycle of falling and rising. This is Sarah's true legacy, not the tragedy of how she was lost, but how her story brought light to so many others. In the darkness where truth is hidden, even the smallest light shows the way forward. As afternoon faded toward evening, visitors placed small stones around the fountain, each representing someone missing, someone found, someone remembered. Margaret watched them, strangers united by a shared understanding of what it means to search, to wait, to hope. In the soft gathering twilight, Whispering Pines looked much as it had 20 years before. Streetlights glowing along Main Street, pines swaying against the darkening sky. But beneath its familiar surface, something fundamental had changed. A town once defined by secrets had transformed into a beacon for those still searching for answers. And at its heart stood a woman who had lost everything, then built something new from that loss, not just for herself, but for all who walked the lonely path of uncertainty she knew too well. We don't always get the ending we pray for," Margaret told a young mother who had traveled from Ohio, still searching for her missing son. But there is power in knowing you're not searching alone. As darkness fell completely, small solar lights illuminated the garden paths, ensuring no one would lose their way. In Whispering Pines, that had come to mean much more than simply finding the road home. 15 years after Sarah's identification, Whispering Pines had changed in ways both visible and intangible. The old courthouse had been renovated, its wooden benches replaced with more comfortable seating, its technology updated while preserving the historical character. Main Street had evolved too, new shops with bright awnings alongside stalwarts like the Sunrise Cafe, now managed by Ellie Mason's daughter. The Sarah Brennan Memorial Garden had expanded, encompassing the entire quarry site. What began as a simple fountain and walking paths had grown into an internationally recognized center for missing persons advocacy. A modern building of glass and stone housed offices, meeting spaces, and a research library dedicated to investigating cold cases. On a crisp April morning, Margaret Brennan, now in her 80s, her movement slower but her mind still sharp, made her way along the garden's main path. She used a wooden cane carved by a local artisan, stopping occasionally to greet volunteers and visitors. Everyone knew Margaret. Many had come to Whispering Pines specifically because of the foundation that bore her daughter's name. The Sarah Brennan Foundation had begun modestly with community fundraisers and local grants. Within 5 years, it had attracted national attention and substantial funding from private donors and government agencies alike. Its mission expanded from memorial to action, supporting families of missing persons, training law enforcement in advanced search techniques, and funding forensic technology for identifying remains. Most significantly, the Foundation maintained a database connecting unidentified remains with missing persons reports across state lines, addressing the very gap that had kept Sarah unidentified for so long. To date, the system had helped resolve over 300 cases nationwide. Margaret reached the central plaza, where the original fountain still flowed. She settled on a bench, watching as a young family approached the memorial wall, where photographs of the missing and found created a living history. The parents spoke softly to their children, explaining the importance of the place without frightening them. "Mrs. Brennan," a voice interrupted her thoughts. Margaret looked up to see a woman in her 40s, hesitant and clearly emotional. "I'm sorry to bother you. My name is Diane Callaghan." The name registered immediately. 2 years earlier, the Foundation had helped identify Diane's brother, Michael, missing since 1998. His remains discovered in a dried creek bed in Tennessee. "Of course," Margaret said, gesturing to the space beside her. "Please join me." "How are you doing, Diane?" Diane sat, hands twisting nervously in her lap. "Better than I was." The not knowing was the hardest part. Even though the answer wasn't what we hoped for, at least now we can visit him. They talked quietly, Margaret listening more than speaking. This had become one of her most important roles, bearing witness to others' grief, offering the understanding that only someone who had walked the same path could provide. "I wanted to tell you something," Diane said finally. "After we found Michael, I went back to school. I'm finishing my degree in forensic science next month. I've been accepted into the FBI's victim identification program." Margaret smiled, reaching to clasp the younger woman's hand. "That's wonderful, Diane. We need more people who truly understand what families go through." "You inspired me," Diane admitted. "Seeing how you transformed your pain into purpose, I wanted to do the same." This, too, had become familiar, people finding their way forward through the example Margaret had set. Teachers, search coordinators, victim advocates, cold case detectives, all drawn to Whispering Pines by Sarah's story, departing with new purpose. Later that afternoon, Margaret attended a board meeting in the Foundation's conference room. The agenda included funding for new DNA sequencing equipment, an outreach program for rural police departments, and planning for the annual Searching Together conference that now drew attendees from across the country. Dr. Eleanor Jenkins, the Foundation's research director, presented statistics on cases solved in the past year. 78 individuals identified, 43 of whom had been missing for over a decade. 19 arrests made in cases that had gone cold. Margaret nodded, taking notes in her precise handwriting. Though she had gradually stepped back from day-to-day operations, she remained the Foundation's moral compass, attending every board meeting, reviewing every major decision. "We've been invited to testify before Congress next month," announced James Hartman, the former sheriff who now served as the Foundation's executive director. "They're considering national legislation to standardize missing persons procedures across state lines. They're calling it the Sarah Brennan Act." The room fell momentarily silent. Though Sarah's name had become associated with the Foundation's work, the possibility of federal legislation represented a new level of impact. "What would it do exactly?" Margaret asked. "Require all jurisdictions to enter missing persons reports into the national database within 24 hours. Mandate DNA collection for all unidentified remains. Create a specialized unit to cross-reference cold cases." Hartman smiled slightly. "Essentially, it would make what we've been doing here the standard practice nationwide." As the meeting continued, Margaret's thoughts drifted to how far they had come. From a small-town tragedy buried for 20 years to potential federal legislation that could help thousands of families. From a grieving mother arriving in a strange town to the catalyst for systemic change. That evening, Margaret walked slowly through the memorial garden as the sun set. This had become her daily ritual, one final circuit before returning to the cottage she now called home. Though her body had aged, her mind remained clear, cataloguing small changes in the landscape, noting new stones left at the fountain by visitors seeking connection. Near the garden exit, she encountered a young journalist waiting respectfully. Lucy Chen had arrived the previous day from a national news magazine, working on a feature about the Foundation's 15th anniversary. "Mrs. Brennan, do you have a moment?" Lucy asked, recorder in hand. "I had one more question for my article." Margaret nodded, gesturing to a nearby bench illuminated by garden lights. "Of course, dear. What would you like to know?" Lucy settled beside her, adjusting her glasses. "Everyone I've interviewed has talked about the Foundation's accomplishments, the cases solved, the families helped, the policies changed. But I'd like to know what you consider the most important legacy of your work here." Margaret was silent for a moment, considering. The question went beyond statistics and legislation to something more fundamental. "The most important legacy," she began slowly, "is the community we've created. Not just here in Whispering Pines, though that's part of it. I mean the larger community of people who refuse to let the missing be forgotten." She gestured toward the garden around them, where even at this hour, visitors walked the paths, left mementos, found moments of peace. "When Sarah disappeared, I felt utterly alone. Even well-meaning friends eventually stopped asking, stopped saying her name. The world moved on, while I remained frozen in that moment of loss." Margaret's voice remained steady, these memories now worn smooth by years of recounting. "What we've built here is a place where that isolation ends, where the search continues, not just for answers, but for connection." Lucy nodded, making notes. "And what about forgiveness? Your work with offender rehabilitation programs has been controversial. Some families don't understand how you can advocate for restorative justice alongside victim advocacy." The question touched on the Foundation's most challenging initiative, a program that brought convicted offenders into the process of resolving cold cases. Former inmates with specific knowledge of criminal behavior or locations helped review unsolved disappearances, sometimes providing insights that broke cases open. "Forgiveness isn't about excusing what happened," Margaret replied carefully. "It's about refusing to let anger consume the life you have left. I spent 20 years waiting for Sarah to come home. I could spend another 20 consumed by rage at the man who took her from me. But what would that accomplish?" She looked toward the fountain at the garden's center, its soft splashing audible even at this distance. "Besides, some of our most dedicated volunteers are people seeking their own redemption. People who made terrible mistakes and now want to help others avoid the same path. The program had begun, surprisingly, with a letter from Trent Reynolds, the former deputy now in the 12th year of his sentence. His offer to help review old case files had initially been rejected, but his persistent letters outlining how his police training could benefit investigations eventually persuaded the Foundation to create a structured program for such contributions. Reynolds himself remained in prison, corresponding with the Foundation's cold case team, but never seeking personal recognition or early release. His insights had helped solve 3 cases in neighboring counties, bringing closure to families who had waited even longer than Margaret. "Do you ever speak with him?" Lucy asked, clearly uncertain if the question crossed a boundary. "Trent Reynolds." Margaret shook her head. "Not directly. But I read the reports of his contributions. I believe people can change, even after doing terrible things, especially when they have to face the consequences of their actions every day." As darkness settled fully over the garden, Lucy thanked Margaret and departed to finish her article. Margaret remained seated, watching the last visitors make their way along the illuminated paths. In the quiet evening, she could almost trace the invisible threads connecting this peaceful place to the tragic discovery that had set everything in motion. The following morning brought unexpected visitors to the Foundation offices. A middle-aged couple from Idaho had driven across the country with a specific purpose to thank Margaret personally for the identification of their daughter, missing for 33 years, until DNA analysis by the Foundation's laboratory had matched her to remains found in a Montana national forest. "We never thought we'd know what happened to Melissa," the father explained, voice breaking as he clutched a folder containing photographs of a smiling teenager from the late 1980s. The local police gave up after a few months, said she probably ran away. Margaret listened as they recounted the familiar story, the initial frantic searching, the gradual reduction of police involvement, the years of uncertainty, the cruel cycle of hope and disappointment with each reported sighting or discovery. "When your people called us about the DNA match, I thought I was dreaming," the mother said. 33 years of wondering ended with a phone call. They had brought a donation, modest by Foundation standards, but representing significant sacrifice for the family. More importantly, they had brought their daughter's story to add to the archive, maintained in the research library, ensuring Melissa would be remembered not just as a statistic, but as a person with hopes, dreams, and people who had never stopped loving her. After they departed, Margaret retreated to her small office overlooking the garden. On her desk sat photographs of Sarah, as a child with gap-toothed grin, as a teenager with serious eyes, as a young woman in nursing scrubs. Alongside them now stood dozens of other photographs sent by families whose missing loved ones had been identified through the Foundation's work. A soft knock at the door interrupted her contemplation. James Hartman entered, carrying a file folder and wearing an expression Margaret had come to recognize, the particular mix of satisfaction and solemnity that accompanied case resolutions. "We got confirmation on the Carson case," he said, taking the chair opposite her desk. "DNA match came back positive this morning. Remains found in that old well in Georgia belonged to Timothy Carson, missing since 1992. Margaret nodded, making a note to call the Carson family personally. After 15 years of this work, she had developed an intuitive understanding of when families needed the news to come from another parent who had walked the same path. "His sister will be relieved," she said quietly. "She's called every month for 3 years, ever since she found us." Hartman nodded, then hesitated before continuing. "There's something else. The congressional hearing on the Sarah Brennan Act has been moved up. They'd like you to testify next week if you're willing." Margaret considered the request. At 85, travel had become increasingly difficult, the physical toll of flights and unfamiliar accommodations more challenging to manage. Yet the legislation represented everything they had worked toward, systemic change that would prevent other families from experiencing the prolonged uncertainty she had endured. "I'll go," she decided. Sarah should be there for this, through me if not in person. The following week found Margaret in Washington, D.C., seated before a congressional committee in a wood-paneled hearing room. She wore a simple navy dress, her white hair arranged neatly, her posture straight despite the fatigue of travel. On the table before her rested a single photograph of Sarah. "Mrs. Brennan," began the committee chair, a senator from Michigan with grown children of her own. "Thank you for appearing before us today. Would you please share with the committee your experience that led to the creation of the foundation and the legislation we're considering?" Margaret adjusted the microphone and began the story she had told countless times. Sarah's disappearance, the 20-year search, the discovery that changed everything. She spoke without notes, the narrative embedded in her being after so many retellings. When she reached the formation of the foundation, her focus shifted to the systemic issues that had allowed Sarah to remain unidentified for so long, despite being reported missing. The technology existed. The databases existed, but the systems didn't connect, she explained. Sarah was reported missing in North Carolina. Her remains were found in South Carolina. Without standardized procedures for cross-referencing these cases, she remained Quarry Jane for 20 years, while I checked my mailbox every day, waiting for a letter that never came. The committee members listened attentively as Margaret outlined the provisions needed in the proposed legislation. Mandatory rapid entry of missing persons reports into national databases, standardized DNA collection protocols, dedicated funding for cold case review units. "This isn't just about finding answers," she concluded. "It's about acknowledging that every missing person is someone's child, someone's loved one. They deserve our best efforts to bring them home, whether that means a joyful reunion or the solemn closure of finally knowing." The hearing room remained silent for a moment after she finished speaking. Then the senator from Michigan leaned forward. "Mrs. Brennan, you've turned unimaginable personal tragedy into a mission that has helped hundreds of families. What drives you to continue this work after all these years?" Margaret glanced at Sarah's photograph before answering. "When Sarah was identified, I thought I had reached the end of a long journey. What I discovered instead was the beginning of a different one. There are thousands of families still waiting for answers, still checking mailboxes and keeping rooms unchanged. I continue because they need to know they're not alone in that waiting." The Sarah Brennan Act passed with overwhelming bipartisan support 3 months later. Margaret watched the vote from her cottage in Whispering Pines, surrounded by foundation staff and volunteers who had become family over the years. When the final tally appeared on screen, cheers erupted around her, but Margaret simply closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself a moment of quiet completion. The legislation's passage marked another milestone in a journey that had transformed a personal tragedy into national policy. More importantly, it represented hope for thousands of families still searching, practical, tangible hope in the form of improved systems and dedicated resources. As summer turned to fall, life in Whispering Pines continued its gentle rhythm. Margaret's days followed a familiar pattern. Mornings at the foundation office, afternoons meeting with families or visitors, evenings in the memorial garden. Her pace had slowed, but her presence remained a steadying influence on the organization that had grown far beyond her initial vision. On a golden October afternoon, 20 years to the day since Sarah's identification, Margaret sat on her favorite bench in the garden. The memorial fountain sparkled in autumn sunlight, surrounded by stones left by visitors, each representing a missing loved one, a case resolved, a memory honored. Detective Laurie Winters, now well into her 80s and using a wheelchair, joined her there. The two women had developed a deep friendship over the decades, bound by their shared commitment to finding answers and their first-hand understanding of how each resolved case rippled outward, touching countless lives. 20 years, Winters mused, adjusting the blanket across her knees. Sometimes it feels like yesterday we were standing by the quarry, watching them raise that car from the water. Margaret nodded, her gaze fixed on the fountain. And sometimes it feels like several lifetimes ago. before all this existed. They sat in companionable silence, watching visitors move along the garden paths. Young families learning about the Foundation's work. Law enforcement trainees studying advanced search techniques. Volunteers preparing for the evening's memorial service marking the anniversary. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Winters said finally. "All the cases that would never have been solved if Sarah hadn't been found. All the families who would still be waiting." Margaret had considered this too, the strange alchemy that had transformed the worst moment of her life into something that brought light to others. "Sarah always wanted to help people," she replied softly. "She was studying to become a nurse when she died. In a way, she's still helping, just not in the way she planned." As evening approached, the garden filled with people gathering for the anniversary ceremony. Hundreds of candles were distributed, small flames to be placed around the fountain in remembrance of the missing and found. The Foundation staff had arranged chairs for distinguished guests, including Margaret in the front row, but she preferred to stand, moving slowly among the crowd, greeting families by name, embracing those who had traveled from across the country to attend. James Hartman approached the simple podium as darkness fell, the garden now illuminated by pathway lights and hundreds of flickering candles. 20 years ago today, a young woman named Sarah Brennan was finally identified after being known only as Quarry Jane for 2 decades. What began as one mother's search for answers has grown into a movement that has changed how we handle missing persons cases nationwide. He continued, outlining the Foundation's accomplishments. Cases resolved, families supported, policies changed. But numbers don't capture the true impact of this work. For that, we need to look at the stories. Stories of parents who finally know where their children rest, of siblings who can stop wondering, of communities that have learned to support those still searching. When Hartman invited Margaret to speak, she made her way slowly to the podium. Unlike her testimony before Congress, this audience needed no explanation of why they had gathered. They were part of the extended family created by shared experience, the community of searchers and finders that had formed around the Foundation's work. 20 years ago, I learned what happened to my daughter," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the hushed garden. "It wasn't the answer I had prayed for during those long years of waiting. But it was an answer, and that meant I could finally move forward from the suspended animation of not knowing." Margaret looked out at the sea of faces illuminated by candlelight, some familiar from years of working together, others new to the Foundation's embrace. "What we've built here isn't just about finding answers. It's about ensuring that no one searches alone, that no missing person is forgotten, that every family, whether they receive joyful reunions or heartbreaking confirmation, knows that their loved one mattered." She gestured toward the fountain and the photographs displayed nearby, hundreds of faces, each representing a life interrupted, a family changed forever. Sarah's story could have ended in that quarry. Instead, it continues through every case we resolve, every family we support, every policy we change. As Margaret concluded her remarks, those gathered began placing their candles around the fountain, creating a circle of light that expanded outward with each addition. Names were spoken softly, the missing, the found, the remembered. The simple ritual acknowledged both loss and community, bringing light to what had once been darkness. Later that evening, as the garden emptied and staff began clearing away chairs, Margaret remained seated near the fountain. The years had brought so many changes, to Whispering Pines, to the Foundation, to her understanding of grief and purpose. Yet something essential remained constant, the commitment to remember, to search, to honor those whose stories had been interrupted. A young volunteer approached, hesitant to disturb her reflection. "Mrs. Brennan, I can walk with you back to your cottage when you're ready." Margaret smiled, accepting the offered arm as she rose from the bench. "Thank you, dear. I was just thinking about beginnings and endings." "The ceremony was beautiful," the volunteer said as they walked slowly along the illuminated path. "All those candles around the fountain." "Yes," Margaret agreed. "Light where there was darkness. That's what we try to do, isn't it?" Not just in finding answers, but in how we carry each other through the waiting. As they reached the garden exit, Margaret paused for one final look at the memorial that had grown from tragedy. The fountain continued its endless cycle, water rising and falling. Candles still flickered against the gathering night. And throughout the garden, invisible but ever-present, the stories of thousands intertwined. The missing, the searching, the found. 20 years earlier, Margaret Brennan had arrived in Whispering Pines seeking her daughter. What she found instead was a mission that transcended her personal loss, creating ripples that would continue long after she was gone. In transforming her grief into purpose, she had offered others what she herself had needed most in those long years of waiting. Not just answers, but the assurance that no one searches alone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.